Hi, Nancy.
Hello, how are you? You should be able to share your slides, Ashley. Can you not hear me? Oh, that's what.
Hey, Ashley. Hey, Nancy.
Hi.
Hi, Josh, how are you?
Hey Nancy, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, good. Ashley and Josh, if you have slides, you both should be able to share those slides tonight
Okay.
as you're doing it. And I think, Ashley, you're up first, and then Josh will be after you. So we'll do a quick little introduction once everybody gets in.
Perfect.
So to respect everyone's time this evening, I think we'll get started, and as others come in, they can join. We have two speakers this evening, Ashley Bushy from Pinion Environmental. She's going to be our first speaker, and she'll do a presentation for us. All the slides available this evening, I will send out to you either a link or attach the slides and send those to you along with a link to the recording to tonight's meeting. Our second speaker is Josh Russell. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Eric Sampson, one of our planners, and he's going to introduce Ashley for us. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end of each presentation.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Sampson, Planner 2 with the City of Englewood Community Development Department. And I'm just going to give Ashley a brief introduction, and then she can take it away. Ashley Bushy is the Cultural Resources Group Manager at Pinion Environmental. Ms. Bushy has 14 years of experience in environmental compliance, historic preservation, and project management. Ms. Bushy is an architectural historian with diverse background in the evaluation resources representing the key themes of Western development, including railroads and associated structures, homesteads, mining sites, farming, and ranching complexes. Her work includes completion and oversight of field surveys, determinations of state and historic register of historic places eligibility, determinations of Section 106 effects, and identifications of mitigation. Her project management experience includes projects from the city of Florence, Black Hawk, and Colorado Springs. She's experienced with environmental permitting for local agencies, including preparation of documents for United Army's Corps of Engineers and review by local boards and commissions in the absence of federal nexus. She's experienced in coordinating multidisciplinary teams, including biologists, historians, landscape architects, and environmental scientists. So yeah, without further ado, Ashley, welcome.
Hi, everyone. We're going to go see if we can share screen or test my technology capability for this evening. Okay. Is everyone able to see the screen?
I can see it, Ashley.
Perfect. All right. Excellent. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you tonight. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, kind of some brief background on me. I am an architectural historian and preservation planner. I've been practicing in Colorado for the last 13 years, about 15 years in the field. While historic preservation is the field that I practice in, I really do think of myself more in that planner kind of mentality. What really motivates me are creating viable projects that create downtown catalysts, placemaking, the kinds of projects that bring people into historic spaces and create a life for those buildings and those places. So I think a lot of times we look at preservation as something that wants to kind of keep things as they were. And I'm really interested in how we continue to use these spaces for 21st century vitality. The project that we're going to talk about today is Englewood's Historic Survey Plan. This is a current project initiated this summer. It is funded by the State Historical Fund, which is funded by limited stakes gambling out of the towns of Cripple Creek, Black Hawk, and Central City. Colorado is very fortunate that we have this very powerful tool to fund preservation and planning activities in this state. So because this is a current project, we'll talk a little bit about not only where we are, but also where we're going with this project. And you can kind of follow along with the Historic Preservation Commission here in Englewood that will continue to have outreach events available if you are interested and want to get involved. So we'll jump over me. The target topics for this evening include an introduction to historic preservation. I want to just briefly go over what preservation really can do outside of that, brick and mortar and preserving something kind of as it used to be. Really dive into the Englewood Historic Survey Plan, again, where we currently are with that and where we're going. So looking at those potential outcomes of how that plan could be implemented and what some of the drivers could be coming out of that plan, and then make room for questions and discussion. So this is a slide I include in most of my presentations around what is historic preservation. I think when we say that, each of us has a reaction to what preservation means to us based on our own experience or our own interests. And I won't get into all of the bullets that are on the screen. They're just provided for information purposes, but I really want us to think about preservation not only as that, keeping something as it was in 1920 or 1950 or 1850, but really looking at preservation as a tool for creating community character and an economic driver through placemaking, through tax credits, through heritage tourism, right? There's a lot more to preservation than just keeping something like it used to be and appreciating the history on its face. Preservation planning, so we're discussing a survey plan in this case, which is an element of preservation planning. The professional definition from the National Park Service is on the screen, but I wanted to share with you a little bit about what preservation planning kind of resonates for me. And that really is in using it as a springboard to create viable resources, programs, projects, and identifying key stakeholders, partner groups, funding strategies that can really set us up in motion towards viable preservation outcomes. Historic survey is really the basis for preservation planning and any kind of historic preservation efforts. Survey has a number of different levels. We sometimes will talk about windshield survey or intensive survey, sample survey, right? There's archaeological pedestrian surveys and more intensive investigations where they use screening and that kind of thing to do excavation. So there's a broad range of what can go into that one term, but in its essence, it's that identification phase, which is that groundwork framing phase for creating an understanding of what kinds of historic resources we have available in any given geographic area. And then we start to move into designation of those locations. Are they eligible for a local, state, national register? What incentive programs might be available, grants, tax credits, that kind of thing, and what programming can we build around those resources that might really draw people in. The examples I include on the screen, unfortunately, my National Register plaque comes from New Orleans because I take more photos of them when I'm traveling than when I'm walking around my own neighborhood here in Denver. Again, I mentioned the State Historical Fund, which has funded this project. And has a wide variety of funding opportunities for preservation and planning work. And I highlight the Discover Denver program as one of those programs that really supports local municipal work, as well as really engaging in educational opportunities for folks. Local preservation programs are some of the most powerful in preservation. Englewood is very fortunate to have a Historic Preservation Commission, and that is who we're partnering with to create this survey plan, for the city of Englewood. And there's a range of things that they can do for their community. Of course, we're looking at survey and inventory right now, but there are a number of things, including celebration, economic development, placemaking, education, and outreach, protection, incentivizing protection of archaeological and historic resources, and a lot more. So this is a really fantastic thing that Englewood has within their community to have a HPC available. Diving into the project that we came here to discuss, the Englewood Historic Survey Plan really has three primary components: a public engagement component, a reconnaissance survey, and then that actual survey planning and prioritization. To me, having a public engagement really needs to be something, oops, sorry, I'm going to jump back. Public engagement really needs to be something that drives the process. So we want to make sure that that's something that has multiple checkpoints throughout the process. The reconnaissance survey we'll jump into in a little more depth as well. That's that baseline identification of what kinds of resources we have available here in Englewood, and then outlining the plan for where we want to start, what kind of priorities we want to look at, what themes or geographic regions, and what those might drive for outcomes for us. As I noted, this is a current project, so this is currently underway and was initiated in just this past summer with some initial research and some initial public involvement. We're currently in the fall and we're setting up to do that reconnaissance survey. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about each of these items. Through this winter, the anticipation is to draft the survey plan and the survey plan document and provide for a public hearing on that document. In the spring and summer, we'll finalize and anticipate adoption of that plan. Ideally, we would target May. May is Historic Preservation Month in Colorado, but we may extend a little bit into the summer. And then we get to move into the more fun part of implementing the plan goals. So looking at the public involvement, this is a really important part of any kind of preservation or planning project. And like I said, I really like projects that really allow for public involvement to be a driver, so that this really becomes something that reflects the interest of the folks who live in the community, and the kinds of outcomes that they would want to see. one of the first things that we did as part of this kickoff for this project was to create an online survey for folks to provide their feedback about what they would like to see for historic preservation, for survey planning, and what kinds of preservation outcomes they'd like to see in the city. That was available through a multitude of options. It was online. It was available through social media postings and other areas around the city. It was also available in paper form through a couple engagement events. We had a booth at the Celebrate Englewood event in August and the Englewood Block Party in September with paper surveys available, because of course some folks are more comfortable providing their responses on paper than they are in an online scenario. So we want to make sure that we're engaging folks from a variety of angles. A public meeting is anticipated for the coming early part of the coming year. So that is an outstanding element at this point. I will weave results of our survey. It closed on the 1st of October. So we do have the results of that survey to share with you today. We had 138 responses, which actually is a very powerful response from a community of this size. Typically, I would see somewhere in the range of 30 to 50. So it looks like Englewood folks are very interested in having a voice in how preservation will look in their community. And the overwhelming response came from homeowners, which was very powerful as well. A couple other items that folks shared with us as a result of that public survey. We asked folks what their favorite outcome of historic preservation was, and the overwhelming response was that it creates a unique sense of place or community character. Additional responses included educational opportunities about history and culture, that it leaves a legacy for future generations, economic development, including building revitalization, and heritage tourism, and that of course resonates very strongly with me, and then other. And of the others, we did allow for folks to write those in, so we do have those written responses that we can address in the plan. And then we asked folks too what kinds of preservation initiatives they think best reflect the community's needs. And the top hit in this location was potential historic districts. So that nomination, that identification of those cohesive areas that represent a thematic history, or neighborhood specific evaluations, those are very closely related. Targeted evaluation of specific themes or site types. So that might be agriculture, like the carnation industry, that might be downtown development, that kind of thing. Making sure that the plan aligns with the city's comprehensive plan, and then studying areas with known or potential development pressures. So the reconnaissance survey is actually the phase that we are in right now. This is where we look at the city of Englewood and try to understand what representative sample we'll need for thematic types, be it agriculture, suburban development, early settlement, that kind of thing. We also want to make sure that we're taking a representative sample from different periods of development in the city, so that we're getting a very well-rounded representation of the types of historic resources that the city holds currently. And the three primary ways that we're going to capture that information are through previous recordings of historic sites, through GIS and assessor data, and through public input. Previous records are housed with our State Historic Preservation Office, and we've pulled those records already. There's about 300 sites that have been previously identified within the city. GIS and assessor data is very powerful. We're able to use year-built information to understand what kinds of building stock we have existing from different periods in history. And then from the public input. One of the things we asked folks was what site they felt was something that needed to be evaluated for Englewood. And so we want to make sure that that's reflected. So as we construct this reconnaissance survey, we will then send historians to the field to document those locations, and those will be part of the planning and reporting. So like I said, we asked folks to identify what types of sites they think are important to preserve in Englewood. And we have a couple different ways of reporting this. We have a word cloud, which is kind of fun. And then we also have the more formal bar chart. And the site types that folks are identifying as, again, there's a consistency here. Historic districts and historic subdivisions, folks think are the most important to represent Englewood's history. public buildings such as post offices and libraries, and then residential buildings, commercial buildings, and then as we move down, additional site types. I referenced that GIS is something that we use very strongly in trying to identify what kinds of representational resources we'll want to locate. And in looking at and breaking down the city's history, and I wish I could have had the time to share this with you, we have GIS layers that take the city from the 19th century into the first decade of the 20th century, second decade, et cetera, and you can add those layers on and watch the city grow, which is very, very powerful and interesting to watch. What I noticed, and I don't think this will be a surprise to most folks, certainly residents of Englewood, the city really divides into a pre-war city and a post-war city. This would be World War II, right? So before the 1940s and after the 1940s. So before the 1940s, we really see a cluster of development along Broadway. This is up through 1940 here. On the left, if you can't see my cursor. And really, again, seeing a cluster of development along that Broadway corridor with limited development outside of that cluster. Now, of course, this is resources that are currently existing. So there may have been resources that were for example, along a different corridor that are no longer in existence. But this is what we're seeing for the city's development in the pre-war period. In the post-war period, we really see that kind of expansion, right? So this is the decades of the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. And we're really seeing that cohesive subdivision. So the yellow is the 1950s on this map. And you can really see how the city's growth kind of exploded off of the Broadway corridor and created these cohesive planned developments on the outskirts of that older city core. So when we're constructing representative sampling of each of these periods, we want to make sure that we're capturing that downtown core and representative buildings from each of those decades before World War II, and then making sure that we're capturing those planned developments on the outskirts of that initial city core and representation from each decade, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then we do have this breakdown as well. And again, so it's visual on the map and then the bar chart, which can really demonstrate that much of Englewood's development really occurred in the 1950s. Again, I think for any resident, this is not a surprise. So as we move forward from that reconnaissance survey, we're going to move towards actually drafting the document and creating that survey plan. And we want to make sure that we are considering public input, taking into account the results of that reconnaissance survey, what kinds of thematic resources are we seeing develop, what kinds of areas of cohesive development, or architectural style or agricultural representation, representation of industry, right? Film history, aviation, all of those had a history and a grounding in Englewood. And we want to look at the comprehensive plan goals, the goals of the Preservation Commission, and certainly areas with the most potential for community impact. We want to make sure that we're going to align with the comprehensive plan. So we want to consider other documentation in the city and make sure that any recommendation that we make in the context of a historic preservation survey plan aligns with existing documentation in the city. Happily, Preserve Englewood's history is one of the goals contained within the comprehensive plan. And as we look at what we might want to create, so a survey plan is going to say, okay, Arapahoe Acres might be a place that we want to look at creating a survey. The downtown development core might be an area that we want to create a survey. Maybe we want to look at cohesively a collection of planned developments that came around in the 1950s. So we want to look at those key historic locations. Do we want to look at railroad related, trolley related, right? Maybe it's a transportation related survey. One that's come up as a potential priority for the Historic Preservation Commission are areas that are potentially subject to development pressure. Do we want to record the resources that are in existence in those areas before they come of interest to developers? And maybe we want to proactively use that information to engage with developers and talk about maybe revitalization efforts and really reusing those key historic spaces, if we have those key historic spaces to really revitalize and create unique spaces. And regional examples include the Stanley Aviation Center in Aurora, which is now a really vital business, lots of businesses, very interesting, right? It's an old airplane hangar, but it's one of the hotspots in Aurora. Denver Union Station, again, locally in Denver, sat vacant for a very long time and is now considered Denver's living room, right? So those revitalization that really brings people back into those historic spaces can be very powerful. Also fits that category of economic catalyst, looking at key residential and commercial areas. As we said, those key historic themes and representations of Englewood's periods of development. So after we've identified the types of surveys that we would want to consider and put them in a priority that the public and the city wants to advance, we want to look at how those surveys might drive future projects, right? So this is kind of, once that survey plan is established, we have the opportunity to really use that documentation to push us in new directions with historic preservation in the city. One of those might be as simple as honorary historic designation. So the survey will tell us what areas may be eligible for inclusion on the State Register of Historic Places or the National Register of Historic Places, and property owners may have interest in holding those honorary historic designations. And that the survey can identify what those areas might be and create baseline information for property owners to go forward if they so choose. Kind of that next step is access to financial incentives. Yet generally for preservation related financial incentives, you do have to be listed. The property does have to be listed on either a local, state, or national register. And there are programs available in the state to residential properties, to businesses, and to municipalities, right? This grant is the grant that we're working off for this property, for this project, I apologize, is a planning grant that came through the State Historical Fund. The State Historical Fund also has grants to complete those National Register, State Register nominations, and to complete brick and mortar projects. So you can do, think foundation repair, roof repair, window repair. So very powerful programming that's available and can be provided to multiple different types of buildings and projects. Tax credits can also be very powerful. This Colorado State has a historic preservation tax credit program, and then there's also a federal tax credit program. The federal program is available to income producing properties. The state preservation tax credit is available to a multitude of types of properties, does not have to be income producing, and can in fact be residential and owner occupied. Again, does have to be listed to one of those state, national, or if available, a local listing. But again, very powerful programs that are available to support kind of catalyst projects and even homeowners in some cases. Those surveys can also be used to create really interesting educational initiatives. If you think about like the Discover Denver program, interactive mapping, story mapping has been a very powerful tool for sharing and engaging information. I worked on a project with Colorado Main Street earlier this year, public engagement project that is now driving an interactive heritage tourism related educational initiative, community outreach, and then the creation of all kinds of new programming. So really taking this as a baseline tool that can really broaden the opportunities available to Englewood as a city and to its citizens. And I might have gone a little bit fast for us, but we are up to the question and discussion component.
Okay, so at this point, Ashley is open for questions and comments. I think if we just do like what we did last week, rather than trying to raise hands and do all of that, if people want to come off mute and participate, feel free. So we'll take, Ashley will probably take 10 to 15 minutes of questions and comments.
Hi, Ashley. I have a question. I was curious to see that
in the survey, the top response was historic districts.
Mhm.
I was just wondering what your take on that was, and whether it was a function of maybe not a common understanding of what a historic district is or does. Any background you can provide there?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think, if I'm reading correctly into your question, folks may not understand that means that you would designate a large chunk, potentially large chunk of properties. Could be a downtown district, could be a residential district, right? Now, if we're talking state and national register, I think there's a common misperception that there are going to be restrictions on what someone can do with their property within a designated district. In fact, with the state and national register, an owner retains complete autonomy to do what they wish with their building. Those are actually any kind of restrictions that people sometimes associate with historic districts or with historic preservation are all from the local level. So that would come from like a design review process that would have to be in a locally designated historic district. So we didn't nuance in the survey, right? Local versus state or national, but there are those different levels. And I think that the understanding kind of is backwards, right? You would think that as you go higher up into your national register listing, that there might be more restrictions, and it's actually the reverse. So that it's a purely honorary designation at the state and national register levels. Local can also be purely, purely honorary. It just varies from municipality to municipality based on their individual ordinances. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I was just curious as to, why you might think that was the most common response, and how, if that's going to have influence over the direction of things, and what your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I've seen that as the top response before. And I can see folks understanding that there's cohesive areas within the city, and that maybe we're better off to represent the history from that kind of cohesive district approach than from an individual landmark approach. And maybe that's where that's coming from. I will say with 138 responses, we were able to touch a broad section of the population, and most of them were homeowners. So it wasn't super surprising to me when the first respondents were all folks that were interested in preservation, and that was becoming the top response. But when we started to get more and more public involved, and that remained the top response, my only thought pattern is that folks recognize Englewood's history more thematically and more cohesively than from like an individual landmark standpoint.
Ashley, just to follow up on that survey, do you have any sense of how many, the length of time some of those homeowners have been in Englewood? I know we've had a large influx in the metro area of people moving in, which might account for more interest in historic designations, because we just haven't had a lot. Do you have a sense of what those numbers look like?
That was one thing we looked at trying to capture, and we didn't capture that data. So that was also something that was an open question for us. It's something we've talked about potentially trying to capture in the public meeting. We've talked about having, and I've done this with other public meetings, where folks come in and there's a map of your city, and you take a pin, and it might be, white means you've been here for less than 5 years, blue means you've been here for 5 to 10 years, right? That kind of thing. And you kind of drop your pin in to the map. And that gives us an idea then of how many, if we're overwhelmingly blue pins, then folks have been here for about 10 years, right? So there are other ways we might be able to start to capture some of that data, but we did not capture it at this time. So it's a great question. It's certainly something that was of interest, and it wasn't something we captured.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I was going to say,
sorry.
because this is an active project, if folks have feedback or things that they would like to see included, I would be open to that kind of commentary as well.
Hi, Ashley. I'm Sue. I had a question. I wasn't a part of the survey, but I wonder, are there any historical areas actually in Englewood currently that are protected I know the post office has been protected there, but anything else around that's been protective? And since Inglewood is somewhat pretty ripe for development, how would there be a protection, or how would you go forward to really designate certain areas that could be long-term historical areas?
Yeah, and again, protection and designation are not necessarily the same thing, right? So if something is designated as historic, and we certainly do have those, right? The depot is recognized, the Gothic Theater is recognized,
Okay.
right? These are areas that are recognized within the state's database as areas of interest, or areas that have been listed. There is a farm, and the name is escaping me. Eric, feel free to jump in if you recall it, that is on the National Register here in Englewood. But that doesn't mean that they can't be subject to development, to complete redevelopment, including up to and including razing those properties, right? So demolishing those properties. So that designation does not actually provide any layer of protection from the owner or from a developer. The only place that that really puts in a protection is against state and federal action. And that kind of gets, kind of to another layer of preservation for sites that are either eligible or listed to the state or to the National Register. I apologize. That if the action includes a federal action, a federal permit, like from the Army Corps of Engineers, or it includes federal oversight or federal monies, let's say from like CDOT through federal highways, then there is a review process about that federal action and how that affects that property. But it does not have any restrictions on what a private owner does with their, under their own steam, with their own funding. So that designation is honorary unless there's a federal action in play, but does not prevent a private owner from doing as they will with their property.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ashley, this is Audrey. So on that same theme, so if something does get redeveloped and substantially it gets raised or gets redeveloped and substantially changes, does it then, is it possible it would be delisted from being on the historic or register?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know this, and maybe Eric can tell us. Does Englewood do residents have the ability to nominate a property to be put on for historic designation? I'm thinking more recently in Denver, we have the KMGH Channel 7 building that had a lot of public interest, historic interest, and development interest. Will Englewood be in any jeopardy of those types of properties that you know of?
So the HPC, one of their projects that they're working on right now is developing landmark protection language and a landmark protection process so that homeowners would be able to go through the application process and review with ultimate review by HPC and the city council for historic designation. Right now, the way the language is reading, and it's not final yet, this is still in draft form, but it's only the property owner that is allowed to submit an application for their property. So say your neighbor would not be able to come in and submit an application for their next door neighbor's property for historic status. So it will be, it looks driven by property owners, if that answers your question.
It sure does, thank you.
And Eric, I'll add that that holds true for the state and National Register. The owner,
thank you.
yes, there must be owner consent to have that. So we can go through, let's say, and take an evaluation of the property. We can identify that it would be eligible for listing, but we can't carry that any further without owner consent.
So where does Arapahoe Acres fit into that? Because I had understood initially that was like the first residential area or subdivision that had been nominated. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, it's a very key one in this area because of the mid-century modern architecture. I'm not positive that it's the first, because we do have plenty of residential subdivisions that have been listed and nominated in the metro area. I might be wrong. I don't know if it was the first or not, but I do know that it is extremely significant in the area because of the quality of its mid-century modern architecture.
We're the first post-World War II subdivision in the country.
So this is Shannon. I work in It's the original homestead for the city of Inglewood, the Tom Skerritt House, which is part of the Denver Historic Society. It's here in Inglewood. Obviously, it's on Bannock Street. So my boss, who is a doctor, you know, I don't know the whole works. I've only worked for him for almost 3 years, but I believe from the city, you know, and so property, he is the steward to maintain the integrity of the historic history of that property.
I didn't catch if there was a question. That's fantastic.
They had asked the question, like, is, you know, property, historic value properties or whatever in Inglewood. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you.
Hi, Ashley. What is the current status of the project and next steps that you're about to go into?
Yeah, so the project is ongoing. As I said, we've done some initial public engagement at this point in time, and we are working to identify what areas we will complete the reconnaissance survey on. So that initial field survey that gets us some data points on, like the Thomas Garrett House, right, Arapahoe Acres. Those are known, but we want to go down through some areas that haven't been previously identified, and gain some insight into what other resources the city has. So we are really in that data gathering position right now, and we'll start the actual drafting of this plan this winter.
And Eric, I'm sorry, Carson. Eric, do you want to update the group on what the next steps are as far as that actual language for homeowners to be able to designate their or nominate their property? So, because it is a two-edged sword at this point.
Yeah, so right now, what the plan is to take that language forward for the landmark nomination process with the larger Title 16 Code Next rewrite. So hopefully that will be in place and implemented by the time the new Title 16 language has been drafted and approved. So that's kind of where that's at right now.
I had a question. This is Jared. What was like the average, like the older homes? What year were those? Did you notice like 1900s? Is there more homes built in like 1900s versus, I mean, not like post-war, not before the war?
We can jump back actually to the slide that shows that. What I found really interesting was that there's only 7 currently existing properties that were constructed before 1900. So there's really diminishing, and I want to make sure that we're capturing all 7 of those so we can understand where they are, what kind of their, you know, what we call historic integrity. Are they really representative of that period still? Because clearly that's something that Englewood has a diminishing history and association with, right? So when we're talking about what period, we're looking at what is currently standing, right? So there certainly were more than 7 at one point in time, and I will jump back to that. So out of what is currently standing within the city, these are the relative numbers of building stock. So overwhelmingly from the 50s, and then certainly kind of like a ramp up from the around 1900 to the 1920s. I would have anticipated a little less development in the 1940s. I would imagine that everything in that green bar is probably from post-war, so 45, 46 through 49. Most communities had very, very limited development during the war years.
The reason I was asking, the house I'm in right now is built in 1910.
Oh, wow.
But it doesn't, I don't think they had any permits pulled. But it's definitely an interesting house. I mean, nothing substantial, but
I bet it's beautiful.
nah. It's a work in progress.
Okay, do we have another question or some comments for Ashley? We could probably take 1 or 2 more.
Sorry if you already said this, but where do you go to see if your house qualifies?
For, you would say, like the state and national register?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Eric said, the city's working on a local register, so he would be a great contact once that passes. For right now, there isn't really a clearinghouse, right, to see if your property qualifies. There's kind of a multiple step process. If you've grabbed my contact information off of this slide, I'm happy to talk with you about what that might look like for your specific property. The first criteria we look for is age. Typically, the property needs to be at least 50 years of age to qualify for the state or national. Some local registers will go as up to 30. So for example, Denver cuts off at 30 years of age. So there's a little bit more leeway there. And then we start to look at what we call significance and integrity, and that's where it starts to get muddy, right? So there's multiple areas of significance. It could be agriculture, engineering, architecture, social history, women's history. It could be a very, very broad range of types of areas of significance. And then that piece called integrity, we're looking to see, is the property still reflective of that time when it acquired that significance, right? So let's say it was a farm in 1920, but right now it's it's been remodeled and maybe the area around it has been developed, probably isn't going to qualify, probably. But there's, like I said, there's a number of different pathways to qualification, and we're really looking at, again, that age, significance, and then whether or not it represents that significance through what we call integrity. So if you have interest, again, I'm happy to talk with you about what that might look like. The state does have a database of resources that have already been evaluated and are on the books as eligible, but there's no public access for that. It is protected data.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank Ashley for participating. As I said, I'll get these slides sent out to you either this evening or tomorrow. I did want to let everyone know that I am on a committee with the city where the Historic Preservation Society is working on developing a walking tour of historic sites in Inglewood. And we're in the process of having that signage designed. So it's mainly right now for commercial properties because there's no way to designate residential properties, but it would just be a marker saying, oh, this is what used to be here. So it's, I think, going to be exciting. There'll be maps and QR codes and all of that. So more to come for that as well. So Ashley, again, thank you. Do you have any closing comments?
I just want to thank everyone for their time and for the really insightful questions. It was a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ashley.
So now we're going to go to Josh, and Josh Russell is a partner with Medici Consulting Group. He's been active in the development of affordable housing in Colorado for over 20 years. Josh began his career with Mercy Housing Colorado before accepting a job as the executive director at Archdiocese Housing, which is a nonprofit affordable housing development and management company. After almost a decade there, Josh took the opportunity to join Medici Consulting Group. And with MSG, Josh works to develop sustainable projects that address the needs of residents, communities, and owners. Critical to his approach is a collaborative style of project management that put individual recognition behind the success of the project. His role at MSG focuses on structuring and securing debt and equity appropriate to various project types. I would also let you know that his company developed the Broadway Acoma Lofts. So Josh, let me know what I can do to help.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, that sounded great. It was almost as if I wrote that.
Very funny.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me here tonight. As Nancy mentioned, I work for a company called Medici Consulting Group. We were developers of projects that we own. We're also consultants for not-for-profits and housing authorities. We work kind of throughout the metro area, as well as the Front Range. We have a couple of projects in Colorado Springs right now and in Fort Collins, kind of Loveland area. We've worked in the foothills and a little bit on the western slope, and really kind of a variety of communities, both small and large, and maybe more relevant to this discussion tonight, a variety of project types that serve different populations that kind of span the human condition. We have family projects, we have projects for seniors, projects for special needs individuals who might have disabilities, providing homeless housing, as most people are probably aware, is something that's been increasingly important for communities, and we've been engaged in some of those projects as well. So a little bit of everything over the years in different communities for different clients and different residents as well. As Nancy mentioned, though, what's consistent across the board is that all of these projects are serving people at lower incomes. And so these are projects that are affordable to folks that have lower incomes. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. By the way, in case you're getting excited for another PowerPoint presentation, I hate to put a damper on that, but you're not going to get one. I neither have the technical acumen nor the disposition for long PowerPoint presentations. So we'll show a pretty picture later, but that's going to be about it. Really be more of a discussion format. I was asked tonight to talk about how we take neighborhood character into account when we're developing our projects. And as I mentioned, our projects, they're a little unusual because, of all the things you can build, affordable housing is, for better or for worse, we don't have that much of it. They're just not that typical of a project to get built anymore in the metro area. In terms of that affordability, just real quick in terms of affordable housing finance, I mean, these projects are made affordable because of everyone on this call who is a taxpayer. They require a lot of federal, state, and local money to happen. And it's at its simplest level, affordable housing today is made affordable because developers like myself and our clients get this free money and use it to reduce the debt load that our market rate competitors would carry. Because our projects have a smaller mortgage, we're able to pass those interest savings, those mortgage savings, onto our residents in the form of lower rents. And so really at the outset of these projects today, the way they're structured is that we can finance them in a way to create permanent rent savings without the need for ongoing public subsidies, which is, for anybody who remembers Section 8 or knows about Section 8, is the exact opposite of Section 8, which requires the federal government to mail you a check every month to help your resident pay their rent. So it's kind of a model that's receives fairly bipartisan support and has since its inception in 1986. It's also, most people know it as the tax credit program, and that's how all these projects that we develop are built. In terms of who we're serving, and this applies to Broadway Lofts as well. Everybody there is going to be, in these projects, going to be earning less than 60% of the area's median income. And in case that has no meaning for you, what it means in real terms is that these projects who serve people at 60% of AMI, in Inglewood, that would mean that you're serving somebody earning between $40,000 and $60,000, give or take. And the reason there's a span there is because it's prorated based on your family size. If you have a bigger family, then you could make more money, and vice versa. Because we are obtaining and using all of this public funding to get the projects constructed, these projects are inherently collaborative. And by that, I mean that, we're gonna be forced to go beyond what your normal zoning or building codes might require, or any design overlay district, because we're working, on a bunch of levels with government on these projects, and need to do so in a way that checks a lot of boxes, both from a kind of your standard zoning standpoint, but also from a lot of other public policy standpoints. So in terms of, our discussion tonight, I wanted to talk about neighborhood character in kind of two ways, I suppose. That I would kind of call it, on one hand, the social character of a project. And on the other hand, I'd call it project has a built character. In other words, what does the project do? Who is it serving? And on the other hand, what does it look like? How does it fit in with the existing improvements, buildings in a neighborhood? And I'm going to use Broadway Lofts as an example. I think most people are probably familiar with where it is. It's on Broadway and Inglewood Parkway on whether it be the southwest corner. It was built in about 2017. Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So I thought maybe I would start in terms of the two kind of components of neighborhood character. I thought I would start with the social character kind of component of this, because really eventually that's going to feed into the design of a building. In the case of Broadway, that land was owned jointly by the Inglewood Urban Renewal Authority and the city of Inglewood. And if you remember, guys, the building that we're looking at here right in the corner was basically just a dirt lot. And the building that's in the back that has a yellow strip on the bottom of it, that was to an extent, most of it was a public parking, a free public parking lot. There was an old, weird kind of landscaped area that went down the pedestrian promenade across Broadway. But for the most part, it was a parking lot and a dirt lot. The city put out a request for proposals that we responded to. And what the city wanted to see here, as they defined it in their RFP, was a vibrant mixed-use building. They wanted to have a very activated corner on Broadway and Inglewood Parkway that had a restaurant in it. They're very, very clear about that. They wanted the balance of it to be ideally ground level retail to match with all of the other uses that are in this area. But at the same time, they also wanted there to be more people living downtown. They just wanted residents down there. With respect to those residents, it's safe to say that we contended with a little tension there. On the one hand, we looked at the market in Inglewood, and we identified a real shortage of affordable housing amongst the lower income residents in Inglewood. And I think most people know there are a fair number of folks in Inglewood who make less than $60,000 a year. And those folks were paying more than they should for housing. They were kind of being cost burdened, as we might say in the industry. And so from our standpoint, affordable housing at very low levels was a great fit. It was going to serve a very clear identified need. The kind of on the other side, though, of the argument, we had people in the neighborhood, primarily, business owners, and many of the business owners own their real estate as well in the area, who wanted to have a higher income resident living in these buildings, who would have more disposable income to come and shop, who would have nicer cars, and maybe not present any problems for other customers. I think there was some concern that we would have a lot of folks living in our project that might cause problems for their customers, loitering around, or I'm not sure, but that there were some fears, and I'm not saying that they were unfounded fears either. But those were the tensions we were contending with, right? What the realities of the market were telling us in terms of what the housing needs were here in Inglewood, and what people who live there and work there and own businesses there wanted. And I think both of those are legitimate, camps, and we had to kind of try to respond to that. And at the end of the day, we ended up developing a project at the very highest possible income levels, while still being considered affordable, right? While still qualifying for all of the funding I mentioned earlier. And in our industry, that means that we're serving people at that 60% of the area median. So we have people in these two buildings earning between $40,000 and $60,000 today, and they're making, and their rents, probably range from $1,100 to $1,300 a month. That still sounds like a lot of money to me, because I haven't rented for a while, but in today's market, that's a pretty significant rent savings when you adjust for the fact that the project's in a good location and it's new construction with amenities and so forth. I'm probably certain you can go find a Class C project in a different part of town that might compete price-wise, but if you hold those things constant, that's a lot of times about a 50% rent savings off a Class B property that's unrestricted. It has no affordable restrictions. So for our residents, it's a pretty significant value proposition to live here. And in fact, since we've opened, apart from normal turnover, the property's been 100% occupied. So I think that speaks a little bit to the, to the demand at that income level for property, for units priced at this level. The other thing that we had to consider in designing this project and thinking about, its social character was not just who we were going to serve in terms of their income levels, but who we were going to serve in terms of household size. And by that, I mean, honestly, is this an appropriate place for families, or is this a more appropriate location for smaller households that might be adults only, or seniors, or maybe a household with, one child, or a lot of times an infant or younger before they reach school age. And because of its infill location in a pretty urban area, because we lack, great access to open space, we ended up designing a project that has the majority of its units as, one bedrooms. And I think we probably have 30% or so of the units as 2 bedrooms. So this is primarily a 1-bedroom complex. And as a result, we end up serving kind of people who are working in the area, a lot of service, retail type jobs. And we don't have too many children living in this particular facility. Again, that's not a universal statement about affordable housing. Is really just something that we felt, given this location, was appropriate. And so that's really, that dynamic between what the city wanted here in terms of having a lot of households, and we ended up with 111 units at this location, between wanting to serve where the needs were in the community and kind of what the community wanted in terms of income levels. We tried to find that balance and ended up serving people at that $40,000 to $60,000 a year range. And then again, given its location, we really ended up on a unit mix that tended to favor the 1-bedrooms and not so much larger family units. So that's really the kind of the who we're serving and what this project does in terms of its affordability. But it was a vacant lot. The Urban Renewal Authority understandably wanted to invigorate that area. And so what we built and what it looked like was really important to the Urban Renewal Authority. I mentioned earlier that they wanted to really have an active retail corner with a restaurant use in it on that hardcore Broadway and Englewood Parkway. But in addition to that, this is my favorite block in Inglewood. I think it has a ton of character. You have a lot of great materials that, feel historical in nature, a lot of masonry, kind of window patterns, again, that are very distinct, and a scale that's inconsistent with what I would have otherwise wanted to build. I mean, we wanted to build a 4-story building and get as much density as possible. But when you're on Broadway, you're really on a street with 1- and 2-story buildings on it. And so, we really need to figure out how to balance out what our budget required in terms of density with what the neighborhood required in terms of, maintaining some sense of character. In terms of scale and materials. I would note that one of the things I found interesting as we worked with the Urban Renewal Authority is that they were pretty clear to us that they didn't want another red brick historic looking building, that they really wanted something different and something that felt a little bit more modern, and yet at the same time was able to complement, if not match. They wanted something that was complementary to buildings adjacent to it along that wall. And so what that meant was that our architects had to figure out a way to keep the scale and materials consistent and complementary to the rest of it. And if that stupid tree wasn't in the picture, we'd have a better look here. We should have cut that in. I just do. But what we did here was, one, we used brick, but it was a modern gray brick, and it had a modern kind of stack. And so from a material standpoint, to a large extent, we incorporated a familiar material. And we complemented that with a kind of a modern aluminum storefront glass, kind of a very traditional retail type in different other areas to kind of complement or offset against that. We also, as you can see, quite obviously, we dropped the building from 5 stories to 2 on the street front of Broadway, so that when you're on the street, it feels, you can't see the 5-story part of the building when you're on the street, given just the height of the 2-story portion. So it feels consistent. The 2-story component feels real consistent with the rest of, like the Oddfellows building, for example, the rest of that. And actually, speaking of the Oddfellows building, one of the things that we did was line up our windows on the 2nd floor with the 2nd floor windows of the Oddfellows. And from the exterior, it looks great. You say, oh, look, that same scale of building and so forth. From the interior, it's a little weird. The windows are actually right sitting on the ground because we just have a higher floor plate. In reality, the floors don't align at all between the Oddfellows building and ours. But the architect was able to kind of fool your eye. And on the interior of the building, at that section of the building, it's a use of the interior space as a fitness center, a community room. And so it doesn't really have a negative impact that the windows, are a little bit high, a little bit low. They look a little funky, but it's not a big deal. I think that the more important goal for us was from the exterior of the building to try and maintain kind of an even line of windows down the block and even cornice down the block as well. And I thought that the architect, did a good job pulling that together. And when you walk down the street today, as I'm sure almost everyone on this call has, it doesn't feel out of place. It certainly looks different from a material standpoint, but the scale and a lot of other things certainly are quite compatible. The other thing that we did in terms of the built environment here and trying to maintain some character, and maybe the most contentious, that's such a negative word, the most interesting challenge we had on the project was probably how we were going to park it. As I mentioned at the outset, we built this on a free public parking lot. So the business owners were understandably concerned. Like, hey, where are our customers going to park? They're used to coming in here. This has historically been free parking for the public, for businesses, both on both sides of the block. Now, it's a big parking lot. And we needed to find a way to provide for parking that accommodated kind of 3 users. We have 111, households here. So we needed to provide them with a parking spot. We have retail space, 11,000 square feet of it on the first floor of the building we're looking at here. We have 2 restaurants, a little bank, there's a pharmacy, a dentist. They all required parking. And then lastly, we needed to replace as much of the public parking as we could that we were developing on top of. So in order to satisfy each of those 3 users, we did a couple of things. One, the building in the back that has the yellow stripe on it, we built that on stilts, basically. It's a raised platform. And so you can park underneath that building. The parking that exists underneath that building is for the exclusive use of our residents. There's about 60 spots. I'm not even reading notes. I had this conversation so many times with so many people, and this is in 2017. I still have it memorized. In the event, we have about 60 spots under that building. And then all of the other surface parking is a mix. We have 30 spots that are dedicated for the retail that exists underneath the building we're looking at here. We have, and that's all signed and marked and made quite clear that it's exclusively for those businesses. We have, I think, about a dozen dedicated 24-hour-a-day public parking spots. And then we have another, let me think, 50 spots that during the day are 2-hour parking for the public. But after 6 p.m. become resident, or maybe it's 8 p.m., forget guys, becomes parking for our residents. So during the day, customers can come and go, park in those parking spots. But in the evening, they become exclusively for the use of our residents. And it works out well because this is workforce housing. But the vast majority of people in this facility leave during the day, they go to work. So the parking lot's empty. So it was really a nice way to maximize the efficiency of the parking and continue to provide for parking for those businesses. Many of whom, really are busiest during the daytime hours. That's not entirely true. There's more restaurants that are now there that probably have a nighttime crowd. But in any event, we were able to provide a fair amount of parking, and we're able to do so in a way that was consistent with what the public had historically known this area to be in terms of parking configuration. And so I'll tell you, practically speaking, it's really worked out pretty well. We haven't been towing folks. We haven't had residents who didn't have parking. I mean, other than just kind of your odd issue here and there, it's actually this kind of shared concept. It really can work. And if you're keeping track at home, the other thing that can work is a limited amount of parking for the residential itself. We only provide 1 parking stall for every unit in this facility. And to a large extent, and by the way, a lot of people have more than 1 car. But to a large extent, it can work here because this project's, because of its proximity to viable public transportation options. I mean, you can take the shuttle down to the light rail, but maybe more importantly is the line on Broadway that runs so regularly. So, if you can locate affordable housing adjacent to a realistic or reliable form of public transportation, you actually give people an opportunity realistically not have to own a car. And when a car is your second largest expense behind housing, it really starts to work out pretty well. You can be a moderate income individual living in a facility that has low rents, and you can get rid of your car or use it less. And in so doing, then you're saving on your two largest expenses, which means that you've got more disposable income for all the other stuff in your life, which, among other things, we shared this with our neighbors in the business community. We said, gosh, you might rather have somebody in affordable housing because they're going to have a higher disposable income because of the savings they'll be realizing on their housing, or in this case, their housing and transportation, and will actually be a viable customer. And so, we really loved the location of this project for that reason, and we really felt that we could get aggressive with the parking count as a result, because 1-to-1, when this project was built, felt like a pretty low parking ratio. Since its inception, communities continue to get more and more aggressive about parking ratios, particularly in affordable projects near transit. But I'll tell you, 1-to-1 still, when you're trying to lease a project up and you're the owner, that's a pretty low number. And in this case, in this location, it's really worked out well. I would think that, or rather maybe one last thing I would mention about this project, and it relates really to both facets, kind of how it works and what it looks like. It's obviously a mixed use project with ground level retail and residential. We don't know anything about retail. It is a business unto itself. And early on, we had that realization and decided to develop this project as a condominium, which is to say that we were able to carve out ownership of that ground level retail separate from all of the other residential components. And we sold it to a residential developer, and we sold it as core and shell. And they came and they found tenants, they managed the tenant improvements. And I'll tell you, I got to know them a little bit. It's a tough business. It's tough to make it work, but they found some good tenants. I've been pleased that both One Barrel, what's the sushi, drawing a blank on the sushi place, they seem to be doing well. And obviously they survived a pretty tough time with COVID. And I think it speaks to the fact that we didn't do it, quite honestly, that we were able to find somebody who was quite capable in that realm, and was, who had an expertise there and found good tenants and underwrote them correctly, and was able to, put a good project together for them. That might be the smartest thing we did in this whole project, is kind of finding that partnership and working with that group in that capacity. Nancy, I think that might conclude my presentation, short of any Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh. Does anyone have any questions for Josh, whether specific to the Broadway at Coma Lofts projects, affordable housing, tax credits, anything that he could answer, or comments you'd like to make? Please participate and come off mute.
Hi, this is Molly. Yeah, I just have a comment. I wanted to say that one of the things I really appreciate about that project is the amount of walking space that you guys left. I see a lot of these new projects, particularly kind of between Jefferson and Hamden over near Swedish, that are squeezed right up against the sidewalk. And it's just such a huge impact. And I really like that project where you guys have left a lot of space for people to get by. And, if somebody's in a wheelchair, there's just plenty of room for people to move by. And also just the way it does blend in on that front there. I think you guys did a great job.
That's an interesting comment, Molly. And I wish I could say we were being altruistic, but we built that baby right up to the property line. What saved us there was that the right of way was pretty big. And I think probably in those other areas, you just have a smaller, right away for the public sidewalks. And in fact, in most, in a lot of these zone districts, you're required to build to the, you're required to have a zero setback from the property line. And so that's an interesting observation, and one maybe planning will keep in mind when you don't have, you know, what we've got. I think we have like a 16-foot wide sidewalk at different parts there. So we just got lucky, but we trust me, we built on every square inch of land that we could legally build on.
I think there'd be a real benefit, you know, in the future for them to be cognizant of that. I just see, you know, with Craig Hospital there, and I live really close to that area, I see these families out with, you know, a family member who's learning to use a wheelchair and that, and trying to navigate down those really narrow areas is kind of a challenge. So hopefully the city will be a little bit aware of that in the future.
Hey, Josh, this is, my name's Aaron Martinez. A question about the project. First off, thanks for, this is tough and important work, so thank you for doing what you do. I'm curious to know, in that project, what was the biggest fight that you won, and what was the biggest fight that you lost in getting that project done?
Probably the same answer for both. Probably parking. You know, when they say nobody's happy, it's probably a good negotiation, Aaron. That's kind of where we landed. I mean, you know, we would have loved to have had more parking. Selfishly, I would have loved to have had more parking. Yeah, obviously, though, I understand. Look, it used to be a public parking lot, and so we needed to meet in the middle. The city, by the way, in conjunction with the development of this project, to help alleviate some of the parking concerns, that's when they made that improvement on the center and the middle of Broadway, that's mid-block connection. That was in response to a lot of the concerns that business owners had. And so the idea was that people could park on the east side of Broadway in that parking lot and use that connection. But I'd say, you know, parking was a big one. I think at the end of the day, we probably won because we ended up with being able to surface park in Aaron early on. I think a lot of people had wanted to have structured underground parking, and that just was a absolutely good. And so, you know, I think it was a fair compromise. We would have liked more, but so would the business owners. It was a really tough one. You know, other than that, though, it was a fun project to work on with the city. You know, they had a real clear vision for what they wanted, which, you know, is really helpful, right? You know what the guardrails are going to be. And so going in, we knew what they wanted, and we're able to respond to that in ways that, you know, we received favorably. But parking was, we probably had more, and I wasn't joking. I mean, I must have talked about that subject more than any other in this project. I mean, I can still remember the parking counts. What, 5 years later, my deathbed, I remember how we put this thing together. So.
Hi, Josh, Sue, I also think, especially the timing on that was good. For Inglewood to start moving ahead a little bit at that point was great to see some activity in downtown. And now that they've got the downtown authority and some other things happening in that corridor are really exciting. What I do have a concern about in Inglewood is, and we talk about neighborhood character, is as all these new buildings are coming on, they're very much all the same. They're very much these square boxes, or the boxes I call them with the tip hats. Is there a way, and maybe this isn't your call, that Inglewood can be a little more creative in what they present and really begin to create an Inglewood sort of icon or an Inglewood design, as opposed to looking like every other part of the city next to the light rail and everything else? And so, you know, again, you were one of the first ones to build the box, but the boxes on Old Hamden are just taking off like wildfire. And it would be nice if we could have some kind of way to create something that is a little more character for the neighborhood.
Yeah, Sue, I hear you. You know, that gets a lot of press too, in the industry, you know. And it's a really complicated answer. You know, there's a lot of building code issues that drive people to build 5-story buildings, you know, fire issues in particular. You know, if you go above 5 stories, you're in a different type of construction, and it just bumps your costs up to the point where that incremental, that next couple stories, it isn't worth it. I would suggest to you that maybe the simplest way to begin to address your concerns would be to have, within your development code, maybe some requirements around materials, and mixing the materials up there, having more masonry by way of example, particularly in a community like Inglewood where masonry was historically used as a building material. That could be a way to you very easily kind of but I'll tell you, and Eric and the planning staff are probably cringing. It's no joke. I mean, that ups your level of review and the code and everything to another level. And where you see it used in like the ballpark district or kind of special overlay districts in Denver, it's a very, very complicated and very costly way of getting things done. And so it comes with pros and cons, right? The con being that it is very costly and can be a disincentive for investment in certain communities. I wish I had a better answer for you. I'd love for all buildings to look better. We probably wouldn't have built what we built, but for the fact that the city owned the land and was able to tell us what they wanted, quite honestly. I mean, it's, economically, we made some decisions that didn't make a lot of sense, but we had to do them because that was the deal.
Okay, thank you.
This is Nancy. I would follow up and Eric can jump in too. But what Josh was mentioning about the development code, that's what will be also being looked at in this rewrite that Eric mentioned earlier during Ashley's presentation. So do you as citizens want architectural standards, whether it's materials, the look? So I will send you the link tomorrow where you can provide comments, and we are gathering all of those. So, and there will be plenty of public input and outreach as this project goes forward to rewrite the development code. So I hope that helps, and I hope you'll provide some comments. Josh, I do have a question. I don't want to take someone else's time, but what are you seeing as far as architecture currently for multifamily dwellings? Are they the flat roofs? We're seeing that with duplexes, triplexes, but what are you seeing coming down the pike for architecture for multifamily?
Well, as much building as you can squeeze into the allowable building space is what we see, Nancy. I mean, and that's what anybody's going to look for, right? I mean, they're not going to want to leave something on the table. So if, the only exception would be the one I mentioned earlier, where going above 5 stories is so prohibitively expensive. So you see a lot of 4/1, like what we just looked at. You have 4 stories of stick on top of a concrete podium. That's, I mean, even in ballpark in downtown Denver, is probably the most common construction type. When you go above that, you're obviously at a different price point and you're serving a different market, right? So from an affordability standpoint, you almost don't want to see too much that isn't 4/1, you know what I mean? Because you can still rent that at a reasonable rate. We're still seeing some suburban, not some, a fair amount of suburban 3-story walk-up. That very common product. And 3-story walk-ups have come a long way. I mean, there's really some nice product out there in that regard. We have done in other communities kind of mansion home style developments that work really well, where you have like an 8-plex with 4 stacked flats that kind of operate within, a building that's, I don't know, maybe has like a 8,000 square foot footprint, something like that. The kind of the mansion home there. Stapleton has a few of those. That's a more of a suburban kind of product that works well in a low density zone district. But by and large, we are targeting, if at all possible, in our at least segment of the industry, 3-story walk-ups, because they're by far the most cost effective. I would say it used to be that you would say, 3-story walk-ups $170 a foot, and a 4/1 is $200. Those numbers today are inflate them just because of what's going on, but that was a pretty big difference. You would have that 15-20% difference in cost between those 2 product types. So you ever try to build affordable housing and you try to stretch your public dollars, it makes sense to build that kind of product as much as you can. And then in terms of just, materials, Nancy, you end up with a lot of product that is kind of a third masonry, a third siding and a third stucco. And you kind of try to mix it up and so forth in kind of interesting ways. I will say that a lot of the cementitious products that are out there, the siding products, have come a long way. There's some actually really cool ones out there that you can combine with a limited amount of masonry to come up with some pretty cool looks. It'll be interesting to see how all of this stands the test of time. Fortunately, though, it's not that expensive to replace, a hardy panel. So you could change the look with some paint, some other things pretty easily. And I would expect that in 15 years, as some of these properties get recapitalized, that you'll see a lot of that.
I had a few questions about just affordable housing in general. Is it always rent based, or is there ever affordable housing that's where the people can own it?
There, the vast majority is rental, Carson. So but there aren't any. There are no large federal or state programs. There's some on the state level to help with for sale. The numbers on the for sale side are exceedingly difficult to make work. I'll tell you that. We've looked at it a little bit and it's tough. You end up putting a lot of money into the product, and you can make an argument from a policy standpoint that you might be better off investing that money in rental because you get more bang for your buck. There's also the question of for sale, and I'm not an expert, but most for sale affordable housing has equity caps on it, right? And so your appreciation, that the appreciation of your equity is capped. And so when I look at it, I say, well, if you're going to take all the risk of being a homeowner, but get none of the reward, I mean, it's not, I don't know, Cart, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, that makes sense.
You have all the maintenance, you have all of that, but you don't necessarily get to make any money on the back end. It's like, well, gosh, that's kind of a raw deal. So there's some of it, Carson, but if I had to pin a number, I'd say 95% of affordable housing that's built is.
And then does something like this, so someone would have to qualify for, what they make when they sign a lease? Does that ongoing, get checked every year? Do they get kicked out if they make more money? How does that work?
No, so you don't get kicked out. Your rent will get raised until you get to that 60% maximum level, and above that, your rent gets capped at that. So if you moved in and you made $20,000 a year and your rent was $600, and then later on you were making $80,000 a year, the upper limit, your rent was $1,300, and then you later made $100, your rent's still going to be $1,300. So there's zero disincentive to making more money while you're living in tax credit housing.
So the leases require.
We would have a lot of people. I should have pulled this. This would have been a great number. I guarantee you we have a third of the people earning above that 60% level at this point.
So the leases require some kind of income reporting.
Yeah. So we come in and verify. If you value your financial privacy, this is not the type of product for you. We look at everything. Carson, we'll look at your returns. We'll call your employer. It's a pretty exhaustive. As a result, though, the benefit is that there's very little fraud that does not go that isn't caught. It's a pretty solid program in that.
And then the affordable aspect of it, that's tied to the building permanently?
So it really depends. There's minimums, and then in some cases, and the minimums are like 30 years. I mean, it's a long time. And then the maximums can be, in fact, in perpetuity. So it really depends on the circumstances for each project at the time it was built.
Was this a PUD?
Was it a PUD? No, I don't think so. I think we're just in a, I forget what zone district we're in, but it allowed it like 5 stories use by right, as I recall. We didn't have to
Okay.
rezone it.
So you didn't
Yeah.
have to do any variances or anything? It was all within the zoning rules?
We might have had, yeah, there's always some weird variances for little things, but I can't remember on the parking. We might have had to get a variance on the parking, Carson. I think we did.
For reduced parking?
Yeah,
Okay.
because one of the things that was challenging is the retail part of it. Normally you would require a lot of, retail actually requires a lot of parking. And so I think part of our reduction was, or the majority might have been related to retail. But I can't remember the details of that. That's a good question.
And then just are there any other particular rules that go with or for a tenant of affordable housing besides just like income reporting? Are there any other things that are different than if you were to do a lease with any other private landlord?
No, apart from, being obligated to come in and share your income information with us, your house rules, the normal things you'd have in any apartment complex.
Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Audrey. And this may be more for Eric than it is for Josh, but are there any other projects like this going on in Inglewood? I wasn't even aware that this was affordable housing in this particular building. So this has been very informative.
Yeah, so right now we do have some planned unit developments in the works. In regards to the affordable housing aspect, I think that's yet to be determined. And I'm not on a couple of those projects, so I can't really speak to those at the moment. But yeah, we do have a couple projects in the pipeline at the moment.
So are any of them in the downtown corridor like that, or are they more spread out within the community?
They're more spread out within the community.
Okay. Is there something on the Inglewood website or whatever that talks about them, or?
So yeah, once development applications get submitted, then we update the project list and just kind of keep people up to date on kind of what the process is and where the applicant is in that process.
Okay.
Oh, I can answer that a bit, Audrey. If you go to the city's website, inglewoodco.gov, down in the spotlight, you're going to see a map that says development activity map. And as Eric said, that will show projects that are in the works that have submitted. And so you can stay up to date on that. The other place you can go, it's ims.inglewoodco.gov. And it's our new online permitting system. And you can search any address as a guest and see what's going on there.
Oh, okay. That's really helpful because there's certainly an awful lot going on. And several times it's kind of, I've thought about it and it's like, what are they doing there? And, and unless I stop my car and get out and try and figure it out, it's just interesting to find that out. And to be honest, I must admit, I'm curious about what's going on even more within, I suppose, some of the residential communities. That was one of the reasons I signed up for this course was, to challenge my own assumptions of what affordable housing and how it fits into the community, because we obviously have housing problems, not just in Inglewood, but everywhere. But I also wanted to challenge my assumptions about how it works and how it fits into the community. And so I found this very interesting.
I know we're a bit over time, but I took up some of that time. So if you have other questions or comments, please.
I have one more question around so with the parking, is it ever possible or considered, and this may be more of a city staff question, on when there's housing like this, affordable housing with, I don't know if it's considered a negotiated lesser number of parking spaces or what, but where rules could be included as to how many cars are allowed per residence or anything like that?
Yeah, that is taken into consideration from just speaking from staff. But there's also, when we're looking at a proposed alternative parking plan, we also take a look at distance to light rail stations and alternate means of transportation. Where we're taking a look at the parking count. We've also encouraged some developers to offer, say, eco passes to potential residents if it is located near a light rail station, and just kind of provide some alternate transportation opportunity or benefits to alternative transportation to reduce that parking number.
Are you aware of there ever being a limitation on how many cars per residence?
So the code right now is basically you require 2 spaces for 2-bedroom units. Sorry, I take that back. 1.5 spaces per 2-bedroom units, 1 for studios, and then you get a half space of guest parking for every 5. Maybe it's 1. I can't remember, but it's somewhere right there.
But that's on parking, not how many cars the people have,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah. In terms
Yeah.
of actual car numbers, no, we basically look at parking spaces as opposed to actual vehicles.
And,
Okay.
Carson, what you're asking is then, would there be a way for a city to regulate how many cars each household owns? And would there be a way to codify that in the lease? So in other words, that.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, just especially for like something that does have like a limited, it's got fewer spaces than the zone normally would allocate, and it's affordable. So there are potentially special rules like the income reporting, et cetera. So I just wondered if that's something that ever happens, if it's possible.
Well, to be honest with you, we put it voluntarily in a lot of leases because otherwise it's a war zone. So you want to tell people right out of the gates, dude, if you got 3 cars, this is not the place for you. Like go live somewhere else. I've only encountered one municipality though that went so far as to say that they were going to require that in the lease, and they were going to come and verify it as a condition of their approval. And it was in Basalt, Colorado. I don't know that you want Basalt, which is, in between Aspen, Carbondale, and the Roaring Fork Valley. Land use in the Roaring Fork Valley is maybe not what you want to mirror. They're a little bit out there. But yeah, it can. I don't think there's a legal prohibition of doing it. I don't know, practically speaking, if cities are set up to come out and do that level of.
Yeah, it seems like it'd be very difficult to enforce.
Yeah, I think you just got to look at it and say, look, you got 100 units, you got 100 parking spots, go figure it out, guys, and leave it at that. Ultimately, developers, presumably are making rational decisions and aren't going to build projects that they can't park, because then you're not going to be able to lease up your unit. So there is a give and take around how prescriptive a city wants to be versus how much they just want to rely on the market to figure it out.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Josh.
Anyone else? Okay, I want to thank Josh for giving us a developer's perspective on affordable housing and character in fitting into the city's neighborhoods and downtown. And our conversation next week will continue on affordable housing. So we look forward to seeing you that, and I will get you all the materials, the video, and the links that I talked about in tonight's presentation. So Josh, any closing comments?
No, thanks, Nancy, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you guys. It was fun.
Thank you again. Have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.